Welcome to the Prelude Talks. They're a bespoke online series leading towards Headspace 2018, which is the conference event that we're doing at the beginning of March, which presents scientific and creative investigation into the determinants of brain health with a particular interest on things like environment, on the intersectional issues that are affecting individuals. Supporting this are Dementia Neurodegeneration Network Ireland, the Global Brain Health Institute, which is an initiative of Trinity College Dublin and University College San Francisco, supported by Atlantic Philanthropies, HSE Health and Wellbeing, Creative Ireland, the Wellcome Trust Institutional Support Fund, and Dublin's Culture Connects. All of that support suggests the complexity and diversity of the area of investigation, which ranges from systems to delivery to ways of thinking. And our speakers are ambassadors from these diverse disciplines. They're activists, curators, artists, scientists, and they indicate the territory, the emergent ideas that are coming through Headspace 2018, which has two ambitions: approaching complex issues with innovation and seeking knowledge from a diversity of expertise to bring fresh insight to these enduring challenges. So next week, myself, Dominic Campbell, will speak. In the following week, the artist David Cottrell, Felicity Callard, Professor of Social Research and Director of the Birkbeck Institute, Alice Thwaite, who runs an organisation improving older people's lives through creativity. So they're a very diverse bunch, and what connects them is that in their own practice, each speaker examines the relationship between information gathering, decision making and delivery. They're operating across systems of knowledge and understanding, and they're often wrestling with how knowledge is formulated, articulated, power engaged with systemic biased encounters. And we've asked them to talk at the edge of their comfort zone, at the edge of what they know and what we know. And so I am delighted that first up in this series is Kate Goodwin. Kate is Head of Architecture and Drew Hines Curator at the Royal Academy of Arts. She oversees a programme of events and exhibitions that stimulate debate about architecture and its intersection with the arts, about how public space is activated. She's creator of a new exhibition at the moment on Renzo Piano. She is worked with the Royal Academy as curator and inside Heatherwick Studios. So huge, diverse body of work, which is what she is, but not who she is. I think a lot of Kate's work really talks about the edges of things, and when we were developing this talk, we talked about journeys through buildings. So this is, I think, way beyond health. This is really about architecture and well-being. Kate Goodwin, welcome.
Thank you. Lovely introduction. As Dominic said, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of architecture and well-being, and it's something I think I've been using for a while, but it's quite nice to put it together and articulate it in this way. So let's see where we go. I think for me it's really important to really change how we think about how architecture is framed in sort of society and culture, and to shake up some of the perceived norms. Expanding it beyond something which it's very easy to think of as something that's purely functional, with the primary purposes providing shelter. To recognise that it really has quite a profound impact on human existence. And to do so, I think we need to sort of shift the conversation towards the complexity of lived experience of architecture, rather than simply things like an architect's intentions, or things that sort of much more about the end product, things about sort of performance, functionality, whether a building represents good value for money, how efficient it is, how sustainable it is, sort of structural innovation, all of those sorts of things. And while I think that they're measurable and incredibly important, when they're viewed in isolation or removed from the kind of lived experience of them, they lose some of their relevance and certainly the potential to really make a difference and impact on the world. And I think it really is because when lived and inhabited and occupied, that architecture becomes interwoven in our existence, and therefore has a deep impact upon our emotional, psychological and physiological states. That sense of, I guess, the overarching sense of well-being. And I think we recognise, or hopefully we do, that architecture can take us towards the sublime, towards the ephemeral, towards the imaginative, and not just in a sort of rarefied experience. I think sort of there is cases, it is within the ordinary, and I hope that will come out. And in order to realise its full potential, I think it's important to have an awareness and ideally comprehend the expansive and varied ways in which architecture can do so, and to appreciate the active relationship we have with our environments. So over about the next 50 minutes or so, depending on how well I've timed my talk, I'm hopefully going to take you through a journey of some of these ideas that hopefully we can come back to in discussion. One project actually that Dominic didn't mention, I think in the talk, and what was going to be the title of this is Sensing Spaces, and this is reference to an exhibition I curated back in 2014. It was a commission of 7 architects from around the world creating these full-scale installations and disrupting kind of the galleries in the Royal Academy and bringing lived experience into the spaces. I felt that I wanted to talk about this idea of experience, and to do so, wanted to do it through experience rather than through other means. And I guess this talk isn't going to be about that project, but it is, I realise, an increasing reference. You know, as I was trying to create what I was going to say here, I was moving away from it and actually realised that there's a lot of the essence, you know, as one does, that remains, but hopefully it's moved on and it's a reflective position of where I am. So I think it's really important to think about expanding this conversation. And I was at a talk last night, I'm going to crib it a little bit. Somebody cited something that Cedric Price said, and I can't find the exact reference for it, but I thought the essence of it's quite important, that architecture's key function is a sort of preemptive mental health, sort of a way to stop society topping itself. And it's nice, you know, we think about this idea of the origins of architecture, of going back to a notion of shelter, and which pertains to a sense of what we might perceive of need. But when you start to think about actually need, what is needs of human being, they very much go beyond shelter. You know, what sustains us as humans, and it isn't a roof over our head, it's all the things that come with that, and the reason we want to do it. And I think we have got very much into this place where we justify architecture in terms of the sort of function, on time, on cost. You know, how many articles on a building will start, you know, the building ran over time, it ran over cost. Well, there might be a whole series of reasons that takes place, and it's not really a result of the end product. And I think if we continue to talk about it like that, we lose something in it. And I think what I notice that we've all become complicit in that conversation. You know, architects will justify their buildings in those terms. They rarely talk about beauty with clients because it's a difficult thing. They will talk about its efficiency. We do that because it will be efficient in that way, rather than being able to say, actually, it might just change how you feel in the morning when you come in, and that's a very difficult thing to do. And you know, and it's sort of represented in things like the market. The market's not real estate. This whole idea of how we talk about real estate is valued per square foot. And everyone who knows, you know, a 60 square metre building flat can be vastly different depending on the nature of that space, how it's come together. This idea that square footage tells you about how spacious something is a complete fallacy. You know, a 60 square metre space can operate incredibly differently across the spectrum, number of corridors there, the sort of height of the spaces, how the spaces interlock. And I think that it sort of turns architecture into some sort of commodity value, where that value that we're talking about is the wrong value as well. So I think we need to really accept and integrate those things which are quite hard to articulate potentially, our emotional, psychological things, and the things that are kind of deemed to be sort of subjective, and they're caught in that subjective place. But I think it's becoming increasingly evident. There are people who are doing a lot of work showing the link between brain health and spaces. You know, it's neuroscience is picking up with this conversation, and it can move into much more empirical systems. But also we need to kind of embrace some of the looseness around it as well, that every aspect might not just be that which can be proved, but to sort of start to engage with those discussion. And I think my intention really is to quite unapologetically bring this into the discussion without a kind of spiritual thing. It is, I think, just quite important and intrinsic to what it is to be human. So in doing this, I think I want to sort of start by a little bit talking about architectural experience. And it is, you know, it is about that sense of being physically present within a space. It's a bodily presence, and that body is physical, it's metaphysical, it's our mind, it's our memory, it's all of those things that can't start to become within it. And it is perceived through all the senses. And isolate senses down to individual things. It is that whole sense of how these things come together, and the notion of being present and fully aware and attuned to what's happening. It's those things, as you walk up a staircase, it's felt in your body. It's those things that happen in your peripheral vision. It's the sense that I know that the city is out there because I can hear something just as we're talking sort of happening to the side of me. And all of those things are helping me to understand the environment and place I'm in. And which leads me into this idea of spatial awareness. And I think it is really important. And I think it's kind of what was at the heart of Sensing Spaces. And it's possibly because, I acknowledge I'm probably quite heightenedly sensitive to space. I'm the daughter of an architect. From a very small age, I was looking at buildings on holidays. I have always been attuned to it. I was looking at plans with my father. I studied architecture. I now talk about architecture. So I am at a perhaps privileged position within that realm, but doesn't require specialist knowledge. It is something that I think we all know, can turn on, can start to think about. And it's important to do so because I think it's the starting point for change. And so at one level, I can sort of see an analogy, it's a fairly short thing, that the more sensitive and aware you are to something that's there, the more pleasure you can get from it. And the really basic analogy is food. I've got a friend who was living with me who's just become a chef, and actually when you start to layer up, if you add this little bit in this and this, your palate broadens, you start to enjoy it more, you understand more, you therefore demand and ask more from it. And that's on one level. On the other level, I think it's incredibly, actually we can start to become more active in the conversation if we're aware of these things that are happening to us or why things might be impacting, that actually we can be much more agents in that process rather than architecture doesn't happen to us and those things of it. And this sort of goes back to something that I think is quite important, because I think that spatial literacy is something, we talk quite a lot about visual literacy, and I work at the Royal Academy of Arts. We promote, in some ways, the essence of what we do is promote visual literacy. It has been sort of sidelined from a lot of teaching in schools, certainly in what I see in sort of England and the UK. They had to fight to bring art back. But actually architecture is so rarely taught, and there any kind of spatial ideas just aren't part of the discussion. And I think it's really important that it is brought back at that level, because I think because it can do it, and there's a lot of work has been done around these ideas, and also the idea of spatial intelligence, which is some people like Leon van Schaik talk a lot about it. And he looks at it a lot in relation to architects and how you actually unlock and what their spatial intelligence is. But becomes quite interesting when you start to see that. He cites footballers who have sort of spatial intelligence, which is brought up. How do you make those very quick decisions? And at a second glance, you're making spatial decisions as you move towards one another. And these are all kind of spatial intelligences. And, as children, we really learn it. It's how you find out your place in the world. An edge, you learn what an edge is, what the consequences of that. You're always testing yourself in relationship to your environment. And I think those intelligences build up. But we kind of start to lose it as we get older, as we start to, all this other information sort of floods in on us. And to me that this is about buildings and spaces, but it's also about human connectedness. And so it's about spatial dynamics. It isn't just around the walls that we touch, it can be about one another. And I have been particularly interested in people like a group called the Clod Ensemble, who is headed by Susie Wilson, who's sort of trained in a particular mode of physical theatre. And so as well as sort of doing dance and choreography, she's also taking those skills of what she learns about the body to work with medical sciences. And actually to say that so many doctors, they know, and this kind of quite interesting idea that doctors know about anatomy, and they know about it in the kind of way in which they look at it. Dancers know about anatomy sort of through an embodied experience. They understand their body in a way that the doctors who know anatomy and how the muscles and all those things relate on a kind of intellectual level can lose connection with actually what that means and what it feels. And so she does this work with doctors to get them to think about it, and therefore what their relationship, this whole bedside manner it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. It's how your physical relationship is with the patients, and to get the doctors to kind of be aware of being within their body space. And I think that's a really interesting idea. It's that same, and that's the same thing. You know, we start with our body, we think outside of that, we think about how we relate to one another, how we relate to the spaces around us. And this does, you know, if we can unlock all of these intelligences, all of these things, I think we can start to contribute to shaping briefs. You know, it's what we ask of one another, how we interact with our spaces, how we might configure them, reconfigure them, make higher demands on our expectations. I think, you know, we get to this base point where we just expect very little from our environment, and actually it's not a luxury, it is something that we should just have. So I thought I might just make a couple of points to sort of frame some of this discussion a little bit more. And it goes back, it was quite interesting. I've had this sort of narrative a little bit. I realised sort of since Sensing Spaces, I was saying that architecture is the background to our lives, and necessarily so. And it was a kind of phrase that I was using a lot. And it was only last night I kind of started to unpick this a little bit. And in some ways, it's shaking up this idea of it, that it isn't background. We might not be aware of it, but it is foreground, it's central to things. And, you know, if we see it as a sort of framework for other things in our lives, I think this is where I was thinking about it as background, because it is a framework, and we do things in it, and actually those things are important and they're vital, you know, where we, you know, but so is that interaction with the spaces in which we do it. So it's not that those spaces vanish, actually the things that we do in it are enhanced or relate to how we, to what we're doing. So, you know, the idea of work comes loaded with the whole thing. So, you know, what does it feel like? You know, our kind of sense of what it's to go to work. If it's an uplifting space, it can start to impact upon how we feel in that. It's not primary, it's not always the sole factor in it, but it's part of that sort of contribution. And so I think when I was thinking about these ideas, it was the fact that it moves in and out of consciousness. You know, it's not like we are always aware of it. And as I'm talking, I'm sort of aware of the space around me at different moments as I'm talking about it. And there's other bits where I'm just concentrating on your faces and what's happening here. And I think that it is always in this kind of up and down balance. But there is that shift through different things. And it can be triggered by things, by times of anxiety. You know, there's moments when if you're feeling at work, it's becoming more pressured. Actually, the proximity of other people, the sound in the room, the light in it, can actually just increase that anxiety. And other times when you're a little bit chilled, it's fine, it's all running through, those things won't have that same impact upon you. So it's not always necessarily, it's not a very straight and direct line, but we become more sensitised to things, we become more sensitised with age, we become more sensitised with our mental states into these things. And I think that there's things about spatial perception. You know, this sense we're not always existing in a sort of James Turrell space, but actually I think what's quite interesting about artists and people like Claude is actually they can help us to understand what's happening in the space. Actually, what is the beauty of sitting in there, the sort of way in which the ceiling almost vanishes up to the sky in that experience. And that's not what we have all the time, but actually we can have moments of that. And the other thing to say is that I think it's quite important to sort of have a balance of this, that architecture, the effect of it isn't always instrumental on its own. So at the same point, and I think it was a little bit where I was thinking about this background idea, to sort of caveat some of this. It's not like I'm saying architecture is the sole thing and the answer is there. While I think a visionary architect can lead and can do something, and architecture can do it, it doesn't do it on its own. It is always in a sort of much more complex equation of forces. Beyond its sphere and influences, things like sort of social policy, politics around it, economics. It becomes a symptom of society, and so that's why actually kind of this general awareness of it and a broader contribution to it is really important. And so it is something that goes very much beyond architects. Before I get to this, I might just have a hot room. Something I've been, and this is in Dominic's introduction, you know, that hopefully some of the speakers are on kind of different ideas. This is an idea that I'm trying to articulate at the moment. And I'll just go into it a little bit, but trying to talk about the dynamic nature of architectural experience. And so I want to propose that it's not something, we think about architecture as something which is permanent and fixed. It is that enduring thing. Architecture exists for many years. Most buildings will outlive their commissioners, their architects, everything else. And so we had this kind of notion of it as something that might be fixed. But I think it is incredibly dynamic, and it changes as we do with it. In the same way in which a sort of work of art might, but almost more so because we work with it. And there's a statement that's often quoted by Winston Churchill, made during a parliamentary debate in 1943 when they were rebuilding the Commons Chamber in the House of Parliament in London. And he said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." And he was talking about, his particular reference, it's a much longer piece of prose that he was talking about. But for Churchill, the two-party system at the heart of British democracy was sustained and enhanced by the configuration of that debating chamber at the two sides. And I think that it's a very good quote, and I wholeheartedly agree with it. That buildings do and can shape us. But I believe furthermore that actually that there is a reciprocal dynamic relationship there, where we and our buildings are both in a state of becoming. So it's not we shape our buildings, they shape us. We reshape, it reshapes. And it is this continual process of evolution towards becoming something. And I think the question is, what does one want to become in that? And I think that it happens through being lived in, inhabited, and it becoming constituted part of our social and physical life. And I quite like this idea of appropriation, that we appropriate something, that we take something on to us, and it becomes a part of us, and it shapes us. And I was talking to John Tusa last week, who was the director of the Barbican for many years, and it was an interesting thing that he was saying. They're incredibly visionary, massive building in the heart of London, that sort of bombed area of London. It's a strong and bold building, and he said part of his role there was actually understanding what the building was about and coming to terms with it, how the institution, the organisation used that building, and how that building started to help the institution define itself, and how then they could, once they knew that, sort of start to replace and think about how they use the building to represent that. And I think, I'm seeing that too as the Royal Academy. We're going through a redevelopment stage, and we're doing it on a smaller scale as part of a process. And I think it can happen as an organisation, and it can happen to us as individuals. So it is those things. But I think the evolution is important, that you go somewhere together. And this idea of architecture and what it means to be human, I kind of want to link these two ideas. And it's something that I think architects do think a lot about, and they talk a lot about it, perhaps sometimes in more hallowed, closed quarters. But it's something that I think sort of underpins what we do. We need to know what we are to create that thing around us, that framework for what we are. And I want to sort of reference the wonderful Irish architects Grafton, Shelley McMurran and Von Farrell, who are the curators of this year's Venice Architecture Biennale, which is an amazing, huge undertaking for them. And they have their theme for the thing is free space, and they have a lovely text about what this idea of free space is. But I'll just read the sort of two little phrases in the sort of beginning of it. Free space describes a generosity of spirit and a sense of humanity at the core of architecture's agenda, focusing on the quality of space itself. Free space focuses on architecture's ability to provide free and additional spatial gifts to those who use it, on its ability to undress address the unspoken wishes of strangers and undress them too. But I think it's a really nice thing, and I think that it demonstrates that it's there. But for me, it's about how we expand and embrace these ideas more broadly. And so I think that you can start to see that these ideas, this sense of being human, are things that architects aspire to, but it also might be a way in which we think about what makes an exemplary building. So it's not just an architect's ideas, but actually what makes these buildings into what they might be, to move from the functional to the sublime, to add a deeper meaning, to define these things. So I want to try and approach these ideas from perhaps ways that might distance it from what we might think about formal conceptions of architecture at the beginning. To understand that these things are perhaps implicit, and they're much more inbuilt in us and around us, and they respond to sort of cognitive and emotional things we have, which are very broadly spatial, and that they're much more universal phenomenon. And if we start to recognise that these things exist, then it's hard to deny that actually the spaces around us really do have an important relationship to how we are and to our well-being. And I think that it hopefully breaks architecture down from this capital A. And so these are just a couple of thoughts, and I'm not sure that they're the exact words on it. They are sort of suggestions to it, and I don't think they're entirely comprehensive in it. But I was thinking about the idea of containment, and in some ways it goes back to a very simple initial idea of where we kind of came together. And it seems that having certain boundaries or some notion of containment is a very basic and innate human desire. And it might not just be walls. I had a really wonderful conversation with Francis Kere during the Sensing Spaces exhibition, who's an architect from Burkina Faso who also works in Berlin, who I was working with on the project. And he described a place of being in Africa and actually how dark it gets. And I only really understood this when the filmmaker who we were working with went out there, and she just said, it's dark, it's just black, there is no light. You know, when the sun goes down, it becomes dark. And he described the thing of space being created of the gathering of people. And you knew from heat, from sound, that there were people there. And it was that sense that gave you a sense of containment in the vastness. It was the bringing of people together that gave you that sense of containment. And it has stayed in my mind quite evocatively. And I think that you think about children making dens. It's very, it's a quite early desire we have to sort of get a table and to put a sheet over the top and to contain yourself, to give you a sense of privacy, to give you something that removes you from the adult world, creates your own world. And that's different if it's a kind of big table, a small table, the sort of space you go into. And there's a relationship between what you're doing in it, how you want to feel with the sort of scale of it. If you're in a very vast space, you feel different. All of these things are sort of notional response to us. And there's another thing that Francis was talking about was he had this idea of the tree, and in some ways the tree is about shade, but it is also about something that bridges and over the top of us. So that sense of containment is kind of there in nature. It's not just what man adds to it. They kind of exist in how we inhabit it. And I think, while saying it's about containment, I also think we crave vastness, that sense of vastness. So it is about a sort of spectrum of these things and about difference in it. And I become quite interested in what I sort of talk about, the choreography of space and how you move from one thing to another, from a more contracted space to an open space. And actually when they do that, it flexes and it starts to kind of create these different things in it. So it can give you a sense of release from going to something very tight to that kind of explosion into something more open. And that becomes more apparent when you have contrast. The other thing I kind of wanted to introduce into this idea was an idea of care, and that the idea that somebody has thought about something, that somebody has thought about this handle, what your hand is going to be like on it. And I become increasingly aware of this with my elderly aunt who's in her 80s, who has arthritis in her hand, and she'll pick up something like a knife or a fork, and it's the wrong shape, it's the wrong weight for her hand. Same with doors. You know, to do a handle that is hard to move, that's too weighty. We have these spaces at the Royal Academy of the wonderful big entranceways and doorways, and it's quite a vast space. They put glass on these doors so it looks transparent and open, but yet glass of 2 metres wide by 4 metres high is incredibly heavy. And so I watch older people go in, and the difficulty of trying to open that door and seeing buggies or wheelchairs go through that space. This idea of openness is completely, of transparency and openness, it is denied by its weight and by that kind of feeling of doing it. So for sensing spaces, we took off those doors, and it was about an openness. And I think that these notions of care, that sense that I might have thought what that's going to be like for you, it goes largely unnoticed often in our things, but actually there's moments where it comes into notice, and I think we do need to translate that idea of care. Then there's the unexpected. Very difficult to illustrate, so I thought, tell me what worked. But I think there's something about here, the imagination, that you confront something that you didn't expect, and it's a wonderful thing when we're presented with it. It's the reason art moves you. It sort of shakes something up, unsettles you. Spaces do it too. You come around a corner and you didn't expect it. You expect it. And it stimulates an awareness. It makes you think about who you are, what you are. It can trigger memories. Those things I think are really important. And the final one of these kind of little collection is that connection to nature. And it just seems to me undeniably important. And it's, you know, that feeling of walking in a park, the moon at night, the kind of change, I think, from looking at a space like this, that shift of being in a city, the density of a city, to suddenly looking at something which is green, I think, which is colour, but it's about texture. And I think you start to translate all of these ideas into other things, but it's a change of texture, dappled light, that sense of sort of natural cycle, unevenness of the ground. It unsettles you, you become aware of yourself in that space. There's the smell of things, there's a scent of that natural connection. I was quite struck by working in, you can walk into a building, you can smell it. Sometimes that connection to nature, the smell of the timber, takes you away, and it connects you to something which is, I think, grounds you in what we are. And there have been lots of studies, that are starting to show this relationship between recovery rates, much quicker recovery rates for those people who can look onto a bit of greenery, and it's there, and it's quite evident, I think, hopefully. And I think that all of these things, we can start to think about how we construct our environments, and they translate from an idea of a room to a building to a city, and it's a malleable idea. So I thought I might run through a couple of examples of actually just talking through, and they're ones I've picked essentially because I've been in them and know them. They are, I think, all really wonderful examples. I am not giving ones that I think are negative in there. But this is the office and studio of Renzo Piano in Genova, and there is 60 architects beavering away in here. There's a sort of sense of energy, quiet energy. Sorry, and most architects' pictures don't have people in it, obviously, which is not the best. But actually, the point I was trying to make essentially with this was actually about the connection to nature. And you're constantly aware of it. The plants inside, the connection outside, the sort of seamless way in which you move from inside to out. The grass extends, it becomes borrowed. The changing light, you can see that all of these have louvers on it that change with the day. And that importance of, as you go through your day, the cycle of the day changes. It's not a static thing. This is a kind of looking outside. They've got the blinds down because the sun comes in, but actually that's, so it changes. In the morning, the blinds come down. As the sun moves around, those blinds can come up. You're aware of what's happening. You're not isolated from it. It is an incredible sight. As you can see, it's quite beautiful. But you've got the horizon there. You can look out. You've got that sense of near and far, which I think is a really important thing to be able to see. The cloud scudding across the sky. You sort of see how this, so it's my not very good picture, but you can sort of feel the kind of a little bit, hopefully, of that inside outside, the glimpses in the distance to the trees. That feeling again, and the sense of loftiness as well. And I think that these do have I really enjoy being in this space, and because I'm aware of what's happening. And actually I want to put this photograph in to remind us it's also the moody, it's Genoa's beautiful, and it's also moody and tough, and that mood of the weather is quite wonderful, and you take it on, you absorb it, and it's part of it. Another example is a house by Peser von Erlshausen on the edge of Chile, in Concepcion, which is 2-hour flight south of Santiago, and it really is on the edge of the Pacific Rim. And they've created this quite incredible house, which is a studio house. It's perforated by these apertures. You can see these large windows. And I won't go into details of the house and the rustic nature of it. I just want to talk really about the idea of light, because when we talk about light, and particularly the idea of a cycle, and I think that we are cyclical. We are physiological, we're cyclical. So is the weather, so is the stuff around us. And architecture has this way of also holding it for us and presenting it back. And I have a great job. It's lovely. As part of Sensing Spaces, I went down and spent 4 days with Peser von Erlshausen, and we were in this house from midday one day till sort of a 24-hour period. And I felt it and changed it. And as we were there, we were just talking about architecture in space. And so I was completely attuned to it. We were talking about it, and it was there in front of me, and it was just feeding all of those things. And it was bringing in, and it was kind of, it was helping, these windows helped to contain the vastness. They helped to contain nature that I was able to take in bite-sized pieces to understand what the sea was doing, to hear it. You can imagine these doors and the sort of wind that moves through and the sound. But the architecture was, in some ways, just giving me a way to grasp it. And you can see sort of angle of the light, and it changed. And I thought this was quite beautiful. I like the fact that it's a studio space, so the paintings aren't there, but the light sort of became a painting on the wall, and started to show you the materials. At one point that almost looks smooth, at other points you actually realise that this is a really rough, handmade. It's not a highly high-spec, highly specialised building. It's one that is made by the local people with what they knew, and that rawness and roughness and humanity comes out in part because the light sort of falls upon it, and then it sort of gets blank again as the sun sets. You can sort of see how it completely changes. The atmosphere in there changes. This is the next morning with the light coming from the other direction. You realise that this is part of something. The house is something that's dynamic, and we moved around the house in relationship to those things too, which is I think it's an incredible space. It's an open, it doesn't define anything, it leaves you there to play and to interact with these things. And light, I think, is one of those things that, to think about it, it varies with the time of day, with the season, with the location. I'm an Australian. Light for me is so important. Light for me is zenithal. It comes from above. It's part of my psychology. I know the Irish kind of have this whole different notion of light, which is just so different to mine. It's a gloominess, and it's a difference, and there's a beauty in it. And and I think we are sensitized to those things, and there is just different beauty in those things that do it. And it's part of the reason in Sensing Spaces, it was all about different aspects of it. And part of the reason Grafton, who actually were really interested in light, particularly is Irish, and it was the reason we put light at the end. There is also something about it which is something about the other, about the divine. It's something you want to end on. There's whole analogies with light, life and death and light, and actually embracing death is quite an interesting thing through ideas of light. And the idea of direction is very important. Zenithal light, psychologically, for me, it's here, it comes from above. Side light is something else, and then it sort of articulates space. It's quite wonderful. I want to go there. I haven't been. But also the thing you can start to do is that this is also giving rhythm. It's sort of accentuating something. And that idea of rhythm, I think, is really important in our environments. And it's, Burke talks about it with the sublime, the endless. That's the rhythm builds up a sense of the infinite and the divine, and that is what can trigger an idea of the sublime. And having read that, I then looked at the estate that I live on, which is built in the sort of designed in the 1960s in a sort of very much post-war welfare state idea of visionary that everyone, and designed by, so it took 10 years to build, designed in the 60s, completed in the 70s, designed by an architect called Neve Brown, who sadly died last week. And it was, you know, you can see it's 200 metres long. It's relentless in what it does. It provides social housing and housing for the welfare state. And it is saying that everybody deserves the right to a good home, to light, to air. It went through a whole series of different things. When it ran over budget, because of a whole series of things. One, it hit the energy crisis. So the whole way in which it was conceived at the time was when energy was plentiful. So it was built on that. Suddenly, energy crisis, it changed all the dynamics on it. In drilling down in the complexities of the ground, you know, there's a whole series of things that were not the work of the architect as it came, but it was problematic. It was then run not very well by the councils and the families and how they used it. And it's gone through a real state of change. And I've been in it for 4.5, 5 years, and I've seen it change in that time and how people start to do it. It started these buildings, these brutalist buildings, which were at one point seemed to be sort of ghettos, are now being embraced. I mean, the number of people I now see around, half of them are archi tourists, but they're not just architects. Actually, there are others coming in. It's in a lot of those dystopian films, you know, at one point, and I think it's going to shift from being the place, a site of murder, to being the sort of cool place in which everyone wants to be. And, you know, that's so in popular culture, it's shifted in that. And so it is changing. And it's about community. It was about dropping, so underneath is a car park, it creates pedestrian things, it's about bringing people together. It's about a levelling of society, it's democracy, but yet with individualism. So you see that all of those staircases gives access to 2 flats. You know, you're part of something. So it's like the kind of whole aspirations people have for their single home. They've got a lot of those things. They've got access to light, they've got, you know, a shared communal garden, they've got their sense of individuality, but you're part of a community. And at one, you can sort of see how it steps back. They could have got twice as many, you know, more properties on it by going straight up and densifying that. But actually, it's about quality of space that was so important. And I noticed, you know, this flat is, you know, mine is 63 square metres, and I think it's quite big. And it's not until I had a bunch of architects over that when you put a bunch of people in it, you realise it's not that big, but it feels really spacious. So if you have a nice dinner party for 6, it feels it's really generous. Get 20 architecture students in and it's really not. But it's that notion of it. There's very few hallway spaces. It's just very well used. Details like this, you know, it's got a handmade thing. You know, that detail, to specify it, for them to pour the concrete that gives that rim is, you know, that's a complicated detail. They would have had to go straight down. I'm sure the builder's curse, but it makes a difference. And all of these things start to talk about that idea of care. The solidity of the building, you know, and one that has a notion, so this sense of people that you have a worth, you deserve to be in a space that gives you protection, that has these solid walls around. It means that you don't hear your neighbour. At a very basic level, it feels very private. And I was amazed. You can see how close across your neighbour is to you. But yet I feel as though I have more solitude and privacy here than I did living in a sort of place when I was in Islington with lots of people around, a more traditional thing. So I think that it's qualities and aspects of these things that have so many nuances to them that we want to think about. And it's not a direct equation that this equals this. It is actually how it plays out. It's how it's used. It's how we think about it. So you can sort of see the relationship between inside and out. The threshold, the idea that it brings in, you know, this terrace feels like an extension of your living room. So your living room feels twice as big because it goes up, but there is a slight change in height. So you move outside from one to the other. There's a whole series of spatial things that he does here about how the soffit moves from inside to out, giving that little bit of protection. So you have a sort of space, a space between inside and out. This is, I mean, the staircase, it's really simple. It's plywood, it's a simple piece of plywood, but it's done beautifully. You sort of see how there are just these details that run around. It was coming from a sort of a modernist idea of how we live, sliding doors, open kitchens. It didn't suit everybody. People struggle with this idea when it first came about. People want to change them now, and as a listed building, it becomes quite a problematic, quite an interesting conversation, the degree to which you can change it. And this is, you know, showing it in its ordinary. There's my laundry in the background, which I shouldn't point out, should I? But for me, it's kind of fine because it can handle it. And I took this photograph, I can't remember, but I sit just, I've got a desk, and I love it. The light comes in and it suddenly comes across my wall, and I notice that it's changed as I've got my head down. And I look back and you see that there's that concrete upturn there that has just been kind of rolled over. And I had a friend who is in banking. They have a lovely Victorian house up the road, very traditional. And I was like, what are these guys going to think about coming into my like council estate, modernist council estate? And it was really lovely. He just sort of drifted away. He's very tall as well. So actually, this, you know, he's used to big ceilings, but there was a feeling that he had in this that was good. And I just looked over and he was just stroking at the top of the concrete. And I was like, that's it. I mean, it is a real pleasure. And you sort of do it without meaning to, and then have this connection to what's there. And it's quite extraordinary and it's quite beautiful. And it's a space that I continue to learn and to understand, to find myself in as well, you know, to get peace, to solitude, to understand what it is. And I think there is a dialogue that takes place within me and within that space. I want to move on, hopefully, to talk about another example, and this is the Maggie Centre in West London, which was designed by RSHP, Richard Rogers practice, and the lead architect was Ivan Harbour. And I want to talk about Maggie's in this particular for a couple of different reasons. I think it's a very good example to talk through some of these ideas, but it's also quite an interesting in the context of what we're talking about here. I'm not sure if you know about Maggie Centres, but they were set up sort of by ideas and things by Maggie Keswick-Jenks, who had cancer. She's married to the very well-known architectural theorist Charles Jenks. She was a landscape designer, and she went through cancer, and what came out was what that experience was like, going into these institutional hospital buildings, and felt that there was so much more that could be done. You know, they were working with architects, they were working with beauty, and actually, why was this not part of this moment? Why wasn't she having these experiences at a time when she needed it? And so they've set up these centres within NHS hospitals on sort of plots of land, corners of them taken, and they're sort of privately run by Maggie's as a charity. And they essentially just offer help and support and a place for people. And I really like what they do, and the brief is quite a wonderful thing to read. And it's about, to the architect, and they've got some wonderful, you know, Charles has wonderful connections and he brings in the greats across the world. But what's really nice is all of the greats don't delegate it within their practice. You know, Frank Gehry creates one, and he does work on it very personal. It is a very personal project because it was a personal project from Maggie. And they ask them to think about what it might be like to come in. And I think it's not about empathy of putting your shoes, because you can never completely empathise, but actually to understand that shift of this building as not being something abstract, it is something that's experienced. And the whole brief talks about these kinds of things. And I think that there's something, I mean, do have a look at the brief because it's online, but the final paragraph I kind of liked of it, so I just thought of, instead of reading you 3 pages of things, just to say, what they say is, we want the building to make you feel as Maggie made you feel when you had spent time with her. More buoyant, more optimistic, that life was more interesting when you left the room than when you walked in. They finish it, ambitious but possible, with a question mark. And I think it's really wonderful. It's ambitious, it shouldn't be ambitious. I mean, at what point should it be something that's a luxury or secondary? it should make us feel better. It can, therefore it should. So I'll just take you through a couple of how I think some of these things play out in the building. So people come to this, they are in all sorts of states. They might have just heard they've got cancer up in the sort of NHS building to the side here, which is Hammersmith Hospital. They don't know what they think about it, probably. There's all of that stuff going through your mind, your thing. What is this centre offering me? You've got the meandering path. It's not a direct route in. You can take your time to get there. There's a notion of choice. It's not saying you go in, it's saying come in if you want. There's sort of that mound in front of you, and landscaping is really important in all of their projects. And I think it's really important in all of these. I see it on the estate. It transformed how people used it. The public space between buildings is as important as the spaces of them. That greenery, that mound, it sort of gives you, it gives you a way to go through. You can see where to go. I think it's quite important. There's that's where the entrance is. It's there to the left. I can see where it is. There's a glimpse in at that window there, so you can sort of see what happened. It's protected, so you're not looking in, but you get a sense of what's there. There's the roof above that sort of lifts, which elevates, which says it's not enclosed. Actually, there is a suggestion that there might be something else that's offered. You come down, you enter this path, you're brought in, there's a gentle slope up. There's a pace to it. There's a sense that you have a choice, and they really want that to be it. It's a lot of the brief talks about a domestic thing that's familiar, but it can't be so domestic that it's cozy. It actually has to have a bit of distance in it. You make that choice to open in. It's a sort of wide, it's a large door. It narrows, it comes up. It uses colour, as they happen to do, this sort of sense of lift. Sorry, thank you, Alamy. Anyone I could find. But you step into the space, and there's a sense of choice. There's an openness to it, so you can kind of see what's happening. But there's a bit of choice. There's no reception you go into. It's not like this. All those things which say institution to us, reception, ding, ding, ding. It's familiar. The centre of it is a kitchen table, and it's part of what all of the Maggie's brief. It has to have the centre, the hearth is the kitchen. It's a table to come around. But you're given a choice. I don't know that I want to go and talk and join that table yet. I need to just come in and explore. That sense that there's glimpses into other places, that there's an openness to how you might do it. You can sort of see it's quite detailed. You've got a glimpse back to the quite charming building outside. There's a space outside. There's a whole series of things that are happening there for you that are indicated within the architecture, I think. There's care to details. The ceiling height, the proportions, these kind of spaces, where those columns are placed, you can see it's held up. That feeling of being held up by something can be quite an interesting feeling. Can be an uplift. There's, this building, this concrete building is being held up by something. You're being held up by something. There's different places together. There's corners. There's that fireplace which juts out, which means that you can sort of hide behind it if you want. You can connect. There's a space between that middle one and the space to outside. Sitting there is quite different. There's a whole series of indicators that invite us. That bit of light along the top of the door. The ceiling goes out to the exterior. It doesn't just stop. There's a sort of space that extends beyond. It's quite beautiful detailing on that ceiling, on a raw concrete ceiling. You start to see it the more you look. And I think these are those kind of spatial awarenesses. And I'm sure that somebody who has just heard that they've got cancer might not be registering all of these things that I'm talking about, but they might be registering some of these emotions or feelings or things that might start to play it. And the more time they spend in there, the more they might start to realise why they go to a particular corner. And actually, as they go through their process, their journey through understanding this, there is lots of different ways in which they can use this building. That when they first come in, they might go and sit, in that corner there where that green pillow is, because it's tucked in next to the thing. But actually, they might get to a stage where I want to be bang in the middle of that space where other people gather around. They might have had a really tough thing of chemo. They might want to run into one of the more secluded spaces. And I think that there are these things that architecture can do. So that's from one thing of a quite rarefied piece, and I wanted to sort of just as another comparison to look at the Leo Surgical Clinic and Health Centre in a town called Leo, which is in Burkina Faso in Africa. And this is a project by Francis Carré, who I referred to before, having worked with him in Sensing Spaces. And what I think is quite wonderful about Francis is he was the son of the chief in a village, and he had the opportunity to leave on a scholarship to go and learn English in Germany. He's an incredibly quick learner of everything. He absorbs, and I mean, I found this in working with him, and it's extraordinary. And he went into architecture, wanted to go into architecture, particularly linked it to schools. His first building, he won the Aga Khan Award while he was still a student, because he built a school in Africa. Because how do you give people the opportunity he'd had? It was education. So school was the thing he did. And what's really great, as he goes back to Africa, he was like, I'm an architect. And I'm like, what's an architect? Architect doesn't exist, you know. An architect, you make a shelter, you put a house above. You know, architect is a funny thing. And what Francis helped me to do is actually just see what an architect is, what makes architecture. And these are all, they're essentially very little means. So you have to have repetition. So they're essentially all the exact same pieces. So there's, I think, 12 of these sort of cubes that are laid out identical. But he's just angled them and created spaces between. You can sort of see that they go in. So those are all the entrances are to the sides. The space created between, you know, it's a space of intimacy, but also of enough distance. You're not too close to one another, but it's still contained. The roofs are practical. They let air in across the top. They keep the hot sun out. They are also kind of aspirational, the way in which they lift up to the sky. You know, they're doing something. They're animated. It's an interesting space. The colour, you know, your eye moves along it. There's a kind of excitement that happens in these things. And they're really quite beautiful, simple, and a very basic, you know, there's handmade bricks made by the people from the earth that's there. The trimming of the top, so your eye moves up to see what happens. He's thought about what it's like for that little kid to lie on bed, that some of the windows want to be low and some of them want to be high, so that they lie in bed and they look at the sky. Because the sky is that thing that you miss when you're inside, and suddenly you're trapped inside, you're sick. That glimpse of the sky can be wonderful, and actually then it's got colour coming into it. The sort of random placement of it that might sort of not be registered, and those things are what architect, you know, the placement of a window in relationship to where you sit is an important decision. And then the spaces, you know, it's a social, it's a place where people come, their family comes, you sit in the shade. It talks to me a lot about what architecture can be. And I could talk probably for ages about these sorts of projects. Because the more I look at them, the more I see within them, and the more you can imagine. And I've probably had lots of thoughts in doing it, and I'm not sure whether I've gone into it. But I hope in the last little bit I've taken you through a bit of a journey. I was trying to figure out where we got to, but perhaps in summary, hopefully, what I want to try and get across is that it's really important to try and embrace some of these more difficult and abstract ideas. But actually, as I've been talking, in some ways then don't seem that difficult or abstract. Actually, they're quite innate, hopefully. And it's what it is to be human. It's what it is to be alive. It raises the spirits. It's being connected to one another, to ourselves, to have a shared purpose. And I think there's ideas of generosity in this, you know. And it is not about the individual. And I think some of this stuff can get caught up when it hits upon phenomenology and existentialism, when it is seen to be something about the individual. It is a shared purpose that I think, which is why I'm so keen on this idea of awareness and heightening awareness and a shared awareness. And it's an expansive conversation, and it needs different perspectives in it too. I think that architecture becomes quite a closed, you know, it's often a certain type of person who goes into it, has the ability to go into it. It needs to be more broad. And that building comes into being, and I think about the idea of it into being, which is something which is continual, by a whole series of things, which is an architect, it's the client commissioner enabler, which is public, it's private, it's all of us, and it's then as users, and it continues to come into being. So to think that architecture happens to us and we have no relationship to it, I think is to lose some of the ideas in it. And it happens with time, and it happens with conversations, it happens as we develop greater sophistication around it. And I think architects do receive training in this, and that's what can enable them to turn some of those things, that idea of what, Francis showed this, the tree, and he translated that into into the Serpentine Pavilion, which I don't have, but you kind of understand what it is. It's a space which has got all those ideas and embodies what a tree is, why it's so lovely to sit beneath a tree. Sort of dappled sunlight, the feeling of something above you, the sense of something growing, that he is able to give form to in a building. That is the skill of an architect. So I don't think that they're not without skill, but it doesn't mean that an architect needs to be, that it always requires an architect. It's there for us. And I hope that this conversation can change. And I was quite comforted. We had an event last night at the Royal Academy which is talking about technology, and technology for me in some ways is so far from this stuff. I live in the real and the kind of earthy and the stuff. You can see what it is, and technology's over there, so what happens with it? But there's some people who are doing some fascinating things about well-being, and actually what technology starts to help us to do, and actually to open this conversation. And actually, the work of Alistair Paveen and the Architecture 00, what they're doing is inspiring, and it's fantastic to see it. And actually when you couple up these conversations, which is why this forum I think is really important. I am inspired by the dancers who make me think about this. Hopefully what I'm doing inspires it. It is a conversation that needs to be broad, and it has so many inputs into it. And so I'm quite excited to have a little moment into thinking about where these interactions are and where it might go. So maybe a conversation.
When we started to talk about this series, one of the things we were looking at was a really complex area, which is about brains in bodies and bodies in buildings and buildings in bigger spaces, and those bigger spaces within systems of thinking and ways of behaving. And it's been a great joy to listen to Kate weave her way through that and try and articulate those hyphenated spaces between disciplines as the world is changing, as we need to change to that world. Thank you hugely for that.